When I started work on this book, I posted some messages on Facebook asking for people's memories of San Francisco, and I was just inundated of San Francisco downtown retail. And I was just inundated. There is such a nostalgic vein for the old stores and the old shopping experience. I did cover 6 stores in the book, but I'm only going to talk about briefly about 3 today because just because of time constraints. I'm going to talk about City of Paris, Magnin, and the Emporium. Unfortunately, I'm not going to include Gumps, the White House, or Joseph Magnin, which all had a great presence downtown. Okay, let's change the screen here. There we go. So what's the biggest difference between then and now? Of course, there's, basic city problems, but in terms of the stores, as Ellen Magnin Newman, one of the creative minds behind Joseph Magnin and a great granddaughter of Mary Ann Magnin, she said the best fertilizer is the foot of the owner on the soil. In every store, the owner was present. That is not the case now. If you look at Union Square, which has obviously changed dramatically, you have Saks Avenue, Apple, Tiffany, Macy's, which of course is about to be closed, Bulgari, Louis Vuitton, and Williams-Sonoma, which I believe is going to be closing as well. And none is really locally owned, but of course, Williams-Sonoma was locally founded. So here we have Paul Verdier. He was one of the descendants of Émile and Félix Verdier, the founders of City of Paris. He was always very present in the store. He'd be walking his poodle around, and he had a private dining room behind the bar where he would entertain guests such as Herb Caen, the columnist, and other well-known San Franciscans. The story of how the store was first established was that the Verdier brothers came in 1850, right during the gold rush. And they came on a 3-masted schooner called the Ville de Paris, meaning City of Paris. And the port was so chaotic, they couldn't find a berth. And the miners had heard about all the French goods on the ship. And they rowed out and paid in gold dust and bought everything off the ship before it even got berthed. So the Verdier brothers knew they had a going concern and went back to Paris and France to bring more goods. Now, the holidays were a high point at the store. I don't know if any of you grew up in San Francisco, but a visit to the Emporium's roof rides and the City of Paris was what every kid wanted to do because there was a 35-foot Christmas tree in the atrium. And it opened the Monday after Christmas. Like clockwork, they closed Geary Boulevard to bring this tree in, and the workers worked all Thanksgiving weekend to get it set up. So the building here was the last iteration of the store. It was badly damaged in the earthquake and reopened in 1909. And it was designed by, what's the name? Arthur Brown Jr. of Bakewell and Brown, whose other projects, of course, included Coit Tower and the Opera House and City Hall. A French architect, Louis Bourgeois, also aided in it. And it was known not only for the Christmas decorations, but Normandy Lane, which was like a French village in the lower level. So what happened? The store closed in 1972. They just could not keep up with the changing demographics of shopping. There was a huge planning fight about the store. Some of you may remember that. When Neiman Marcus bought it, they said they weren't going to change it. It's a beautiful Beaux-Arts, or was a beautiful Beaux-Arts building. But they found that it needed so much work that they wanted to change it, and there was a huge lawsuit. And they won, and Philip Johnson designed the exterior, and they agreed to keep some of the interior. To me, it's sort of a mishmash, but now it's a Neiman Marcus. City of Paris did a very defiant note at the end. They said, "We are solvent. No one can force us to go out of business. We are doing it voluntarily. There will be no bankruptcy or receivership. We shall honor all of our obligations as we have in the past and bow out in a dignified and honorable manner befitting our San Francisco tradition. Thank you and au revoir." So that was the end of City of Paris. Then we have I Magnin, and this is Mary Ann and Isaac. These are the founders of I Magnin. They came from Holland in 1875. This is really a story of immigrants. And they came around the Horn with their seven children. And they started off, Isaac was a gilder by trade, but he was also sort of a radical. He liked riding his bike around Union Square, handing out political tracts. And Mary Ann was really the driving force behind I Magnin. And she was an expert seamstress, and her goods were very much in demand, especially by the Nob Hill matrons, the new money, and the ladies of the Barbary Coast. So that's how they first got their start, and they were really known for high quality goods. They trained all their children in retail. And actually, Joseph left the fold to found Joseph Magnin, which is a whole different story in itself. But they were known for being very aimed at a very high-end market that liked elegance. Here is the building designed by Timothy Pfluger. And the reason it's flat on the front is because Grover Magnin, who was president at the time, hated pigeons. And he lived in the St. Francis Hotel, and he had seen what those pigeons did to various exterior parts of the St. Francis. So he wanted it to be smooth marble, and that's what Pfluger did. And here's the famous fifth floor bathroom, which was still open when I was a kid, but it was kind of an oasis downtown for women who wanted to go use a restroom. So that's what I Magnin was famous for. So they merged with Bullock's. They had a pretty robust catalog business, but they too couldn't keep up. They expanded greatly and finally folded in 1994. And then we have the Emporium. This distinguished looking fellow is actually my great-great-grandfather, F.W. Dorman. And he and some partners took over a failing business on Market Street and established the Emporium. The previous business had been a bunch of stores individually managed within the big building there, which had been designed by Albert Pisis. And Dorman and his fellow retailers decided to make central management. And it was kind of the polar opposite store from I Magnin. It was really aimed at the middle class. And I've got so many memories from people about their experiences growing up and going to the Emporium, the roof rides, Santa, first, jacket for school, you name it. It was a place to go, and their bargain basement was a big hit. So they were located what was called south of the slot. The slot were the streetcar tracks, and that was considered just way riskier, but Dorman and his partners made it work for a good 100 years till the mid-90s. And they really had a big Christmas business, as I said. The roof rides were every kid's dream. And they would haul these various rides up the side of the building because they were too big to fit in the elevators. And here's the famous dome on the left. And you could go have tea and listen to an orchestra or dance under the dome of the Emporium. So they expanded greatly. Their next venture was out in Stonestown in the late 50s with lots of parking. And they ended up expanding all over California. But they were taken over by different owners, and finally everything went south after the '89 earthquake. They just didn't have the cash to keep up, and they folded as well in 1996. So I think I think I've used my 15 minutes. I didn't want to go on too long. Well, of course, everybody knows, I'll just say one more thing about the Emporium and the building. It became the Westfield Mall, and that's a whole nother story in itself, because Nordstrom's pulled out a year or so ago, and it's really, really struggling. But they rebranded it the Emporium Center, I think. So things do tend to come around, but I think Westfield defaulted on its loans, and so it's in transition, and the city is looking at various uses for it. But that's a topic for the shopping mall experts who are going to follow me.
Thank you, Anne.
Sure.
That's a great window into the history of San Francisco stores. So I'm sure there will be some questions for you. So I hope you can hang around with us.
Sure. I'll stop
Uh,
sharing.
okay, great. I believe our next speaker is Mr. Jeffrey Hardwick. Jeff is the director of the Division of Public Programs for the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's also the author of Mall Maker, Victor Gruen, Architect of an American Dream. His academic background is in American Studies. He has a doctorate from Yale University and an undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley. Go Bears! Um, and he has taught 20th century American history, architectural history, and public history at numerous universities. He currently teaches at the Smithsonian Institution's History of Decorative Arts at George Washington University. So welcome, Jeff. Whenever you're ready, feel free to share your screen, and we look forward to seeing your slides.
Is that is that sharing now or no?
Not yet.
Try the. Didn't we run into this earlier?
We may have.
Let's see.
Try it once more, maybe.
How about?
There we are.
There we go. Yes.
We see it now.
Bueno, excellent. Thank you, John, for the nice introduction. Thanks for everybody being here. It's fun to talk about Gruen. I will admit, I wrote this book on Gruen ages ago, so it's testing my memory a little bit. So I'm going to give sort of an overview of Gruen, look at a couple of his shopping malls, and then happy to talk more about sort of retail theories of shopping malls and stuff. So first of all, Gruen. So he was a Viennese art student who dropped out of art school and is in Vienna in the 20s and 30s. He flees when the Nazis come in 1938 and ends up in New York City. He's originally Victor Gruen Baum, shortens his name to Gruen, and begins doing retail stores in Manhattan. So sort of Fifth Avenue boutiques. And at that point, he becomes sort of, it's the Depression. People are trying to lure consumers to open their pocketbook and spend more money in some way. Gruen quickly, I guess, adapts to the American system and begins promulgating theories of trying to create impulse buyers. So Gruen really wants to transition people from walking the sidewalk to coming into the store. And so that's sort of, he becomes known for that. It ends up being called the Gruen effect or Gruen transfer. I like to think of it, it's that moment, you walk into Target with a list that you're going to get, I don't know, a pair of socks and some eggs or something. And because of kind of the confusion and the lights and the color, you throw caution to the wind and begin impulse buying stuff and just grabbing stuff off the shelves. And that's kind of what Gruen ends up doing throughout his career, trying to figure out ways to turn individuals into shoppers who are especially doing impulse buys. And so you see it in his early work at retail stores and then later in his shopping malls as well. So he eventually moves out to LA in 1941, and then he gets his first sort of, he's doing larger retail. He does a department store in LA, Mill Irons. in the 40s, and then he gets his first big shopping center commission with Hudson's out of Detroit. And this is Northland. This is built in 1954. Northland is a phenomenal success when it originally opens. It's difficult to capture sort of the enthusiasm behind the opening of shopping centers. And part of that is, I guess, in terms of thinking about suburbia, suburbia at that moment is primarily not zoned commercially, and the emphasis is on residential movement out there. And so Gruen's idea is to bring all the retail to one location, zone against further retailing, and then you will not lead to having strips and commercial areas that will degrade property values. And so it's more of a city planning idea than maybe an architectural idea. They purchase vast amounts of land, and these early shopping malls get tons of press attention. So they get, Fortune magazine articles, in the trade press like Chain Store Age, Architectural Forum. They're all sort of fascinated by the size of these shopping centers. This one is not enclosed, so it's more on a pedestrian mall plan, with Hudson's being the large department store in the middle, and then surrounded by not chain stores usually at this moment, but more local retailers who are moving from downtown to the suburbs. It is interesting though. I mean, you can even see on this one at the top right-hand corner, there's a supermarket. And so they see it as it's going to cut across different sort of divisions in retailing. So you're going to have a supermarket, you're going to have a high-end department store, you're going to have specialty retailers, you're going to have a radio station often, sometimes libraries. Gruen very much argued throughout his career that the reason they're creating shopping centers is to bring culture and community to the suburbs. And so he really almost doth protest too much in terms of his arguments that it's going to provide community infrastructure and facilities. So he wants to include daycare centers for children, libraries, post offices, all sorts of different types of usage. He also originally in his planning imagines these as multi-use projects, so that you would put in apartment buildings, you'd have workplaces, you've have office buildings as well, but quickly it gets narrowed down to shopping centers. He also, and this is part, I think, of his influence, is Gruen is super prolific. He's constantly writing sort of guides to how to do something. So even before he's built a shopping center, he publishes a big survey of shopping malls with this retail analyst, Larry Smith, in Architectural Forum as a long article that they later turn into this Shopping Towns USA, which comes out sort of 1960. So after he does a lot of his malls, but it's grounded on some of the ideas he's putting in, promoting earlier. For Gruen, he sees it as, so this is the plan that he puts together for Hudson's. He sees it as this Hudson's downtown store is going to always maintain their market share, is his belief, yet they're going to, capture these different new suburban markets with these new malls. So Eastland Center, Northland Center, Westland Center, all being catering to a suburban crowd, meaning a working class population that's becoming a white middle class, leaving the city of Detroit, and quickly those shopping malls and the Hudson's also begin outpacing in terms of sales, the downtown Hudson. So it ends up sort of gutting the downtowns as well. I mean, no newsflash there to us, but to them, it was kind of, they sort of imagined it wouldn't. They thought it would be a different clientele, different type of product. This is his later Eastland, which again, you see is sort of is outdoors, not enclosed. And the next enclosed one is Southdale, is the first enclosed mall that we get in the US. This is 1956 in Edina, Minnesota. He does this for Dayton's department store. It's a similar model in terms of it has a large open air sort of plaza in the middle, which is called the Garden, I forget actually, Garden of Perpetual Spring, I think it is, especially for Minnesota. It's filled with distracting things. It's filled with a cafe, a goldfish pond, a Bertoia sculpture you see here. It's got a radio station in it where you can watch the DJ play stuff. It's a really large area. And for Gruen, he sees it as this creating essentially, you know, what we would think of as like a third space, a third place where people are going to go hang out, create community, you know, of course, drive their car there and then become pedestrians. This is other pictures of Southdale. It is, like I said, it's enclosed, and I guess it's hard to capture the excitement around Southdale, but it was crazy in terms of coverage. Time Magazine goes and covers it, Women's Wear Daily, Fortune, Frank Lloyd Wright has asked for his opinion about it, and everybody's sort of focused on how it's going to change suburbia, change people's lives, and begin sort of, and it becomes sort of, so interestingly, it doesn't become, people often say it becomes the model for suburban shopping malls. But if you look at the details, what we end up getting in suburban shopping malls are much smaller pedestrian areas. So it's easier to shop on both sides of the street, essentially, the sidewalk, right? As you're walking, you can look on both sides and go into the stores. Gruen imagined these very large plazas almost. He's looking at European models. He always says in his writings that he's recreating the European town square, or in this case, specifically, he's looking at a galleria in Rome, the Vittorio Emanuele Due gallery. He takes the measurements of that interior space and sends them to his partners in LA and tells them to use those. So he's very consciously trying to recreate sort of the urbanity of Europe in what he sees as a soulless, automobile-filled, chaotic culture of American suburbs. More pictures of Southdale. And eventually, of course, even with Gruen's great plans and ideas that he's going to limit the commercial development to the shopping center, and so therefore not let commercial sprawl happen. Of course, the developers realize there's profits to be made in all these other lots around and begin putting up more buildings and more retail structures. And Gruen then quickly turns on the shopping mall and he turns his attention to downtown. And so he ends up leading calls for and efforts to revitalize American downtowns, which have lost, their residential tax base as the white working class and middle class have moved out. They are beginning to lose their industrial tax base and they're beginning to lose their commercial tax base. And so the big issue for downtown is how to bring essentially those white middle class dollars back. And so it's very focused on this idea that you're going to lure the middle class back downtown by recreating a shopping mall, a suburban shopping mall in downtown. This is a picture of a plan he had for Fort Worth that would be essentially, I laugh because it sounds crazy. It's like 6 large parking lots around a massive town center. And the idea, of course, would be that you would drive in on your new highways, park your car in the parking garage, and then spend an afternoon or an evening downtown. It does end up happening. I don't know if you'll recognize this. It's the Fulton Mall in Fresno that Gruen does. He does a lot of these pedestrian malls. He does it in Kalamazoo, in Boulder. a couple other plans. There's a Midtown Plaza Mall, downtown Rochester, New Haven, Connecticut does a large shopping mall that Gruen doesn't plan, but has a hand in the earlier plans of. And so Gruen ends up doing these urban renewal projects. Of course, they're completely different in terms of the monies coming from federal government. You don't have one developer redoing the entire area, so there's not as much control over it. And frankly, they don't end up being that successful. Gruen eventually leaves the States after a lot of the urban riots, uprising of the 1960s. And he, I think, becomes pretty disillusioned and moves back to Vienna in 68 and continues writing, continues doing shopping centers in Europe as well. And at that point, he has an article and a speech that he gives where he declares he refuses to pay alimony for those bastard developments that have become the suburban shopping mall. So in the end, he ends up being this great critic of American suburbia and shopping centers. And that is it. I think that is right on time. Back to you, John.
Excellent, Jeff. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful summary. I know we're trying to do the 15-minute version here, and it's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I appreciate everybody keeping on time. Our last speaker today, yeah, of course. Our last speaker will be David Smiley, and David will also be talking to a related subject. The title of his book is Pedestrian Modern, Shopping and American Architecture. We later I'll point you to where you can find all of these books. But very briefly, I'll introduce David here. He's the associate director and the adjunct associate professor at the GSAPP program at Columbia University, author of Pedestrian Modern, and he contributed to an essay on Broadacre City to the 2017 Museum of Modern Art catalog and exhibit Frank Lloyd Wright at 150, Unpacking the Archive. He's also contributed to Making Suburbia, New Histories of Everyday America, and author of a lot of other works, which I won't read out here. But David, welcome to today's program. Thank you for making the time today.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will dig right in. I love to follow Jeff because his work is so great on Gruen, and I'm going to take you, how shall I say, around Gruen. I guess best way to put it. Gruen and others before and after. It's a great combo. We should do an act in Las Vegas or something. Okay, where is my share button? There we go. Okay. And view. Okay, is that good? Everybody see what they need to see? All right. Well, yes. The thing about malls is that I have kind of been struggling with, which is, are they malls? Are they suburbs? Are they little cities? Are they communities? And I've struggled even to this day to kind of figure out what kind of place is a mall. And I always challenge my students to come up with other words. And so far we have been unsuccessful. But I start out appropriately with probably one of the greatest inventions ever, as Jeff was describing. This is Southdale, 1956. And you look at it and you go, yeah, it's a mall. I get it. And I think we live in a time where malls are the landscape that we know very well. And they have transformed much of the world, and much of the world continues to build these sorts of interiorized environments. Every country in the world is trying to do this for various reasons, which we can get into if somebody wants to know more about that. I think that I'm going to go backwards for a while. So this is 1954. Northland, as Jeff also mentioned. And I just want to show you a few of the scenes because we're so used to the indoor mall, although we are seeing the return of outdoor shopping environments. So there's a kind of strange symmetry about that. And I'll talk about that at the end. Um, and these were for car driving, sort of, wealthy white, middle class white suburbanites. They put art at the mall. There's a kind of a happy um, environment. Gruen said, we need an art program, but it's for women and kids, nothing threatening. But I do want to point out something about Northland, which is really interesting, which is the bus drop off. And it's an indicator that Gruen and many other developers thought that this would still be a kind of urban environment in some way, that they had to get people there. And it was still a kind of echo of a city kind of place where you would have buses. And that two-level entry system with buses above, to me, is an architecturally and urbanistically important notion, not just about shopping per se.
Hey,
And in
David,
fact,
very quickly.
yeah.
Sorry, I see that you're in speaker mode on your slides. Are you able to switch to the other full screen mode?
Oh, so everybody's seeing everything?
Yeah, we're looking at the speaker, yeah, view, I guess
Oh.
you would call it.
So what would I'm sorry,
So
so
under
we want a
uh,
slideshow, a presenter view? No,
slideshow, I think.
slideshow. Oh,
There we go.
darn. Okay, good. Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
no
You
worries.
think I would get it right. So anyway, you see the buses better, and I always look at that image of the kind of showing the expectations of a shopping mall as still a shopping center, as still kind of an urban an experience of some sort for a more exclusive community. And as Jeff also pointed out, Gruen was very interested in the planning of new landscapes. He didn't really want to call them suburbs. He wanted to call them a new urban landscape. And you can see here with Northland at the core, of course, surrounded by parking, but apartments, hotels, hospitals, businesses, as well as single-family homes. That for him, the shopping center was a kind of node with a whole full set of urban elements around it, that it would be a kind of new, not a city, not quite a suburb, but somehow this a kind of what I would call a modernist aspiration for a kind of new landscape, a new way of living. And cars obviously were central, even though there were still bus systems surviving and Gruen proposed. So I like to think of Gruen, which he did later in life, planning for new towns and new cities as kind of coming together here. And someone did ask, I saw it in the comments about the about civil defense and in fact, um, North Northland was proposed as a during the funding phase when the Korean War was still going on. Gruen proposed that it would also serve as a civil defense center. I think Jeff showed an image of the shopping centers around Detroit. They too were going to be. This is one of them that Gruen proposed that they serve as bomb shelters. So I'm not sure if it was real or just rhetoric, but it was in the air, and that's always a good little piece to understand about the capacity of these places. But Gruen was not, Gruen looked around and people looked to Gruen. On the left, an image sent, I'm sorry, on the right is an image sent to Gruen from a shopping mall called the Line Bond. The developer sent this image of a shopping center in uh, uh, in Rotterdam, and said, "This is what we're working on," and it became very famous. You see on the left, Urban Land Institute called it Europe's Fifth Avenue, a downtown shopping center. But they sent it to Gruen, knowing that he was working in cities and in suburbs, and so there was a kind of an experimentation, in Rotterdam, which had been leveled during World War II. This new shopping center, which is still thriving today, was sent to Gruen, and he spoke about it very often as a kind of inspiration. And so, but going backwards further, we need to look in the 1940s, uh, before and after World War II, where many architects and planners were thinking about what what could the city be? What would the city need to become? So on the left, an image from Architectural Forum in 1943, where they're proposing to pedestrianize the downtown. You see here, pedestrianize the main street, and this was the image that they proposed. George Nelson did some of these drawings, very famous, kind of fantastic architect and designer and editor. Your children could romp where you shop. But this was meant to be in downtown Syracuse. So it wasn't entirely that cities were not yet written off, let's say, since we're going backwards, but this would be a great place to go with the hotels and restaurants and a city hall, that the city could actually perform some of its former, what would later be abandoned. And I always look for images of women and children because those are indicators, especially white women and children, because those are indicators that it's safe, it's good, it's pleasurable, it's for fun, it's a kind of safe place to be. And so this is going on even before Gruen. Well, Gruen was still doing stores actually, and he also did a proposal for this same issue of Architectural Forum of a small shopping center, which is itself fascinating. But the architects who were eventually going to do shopping centers were very aware of all these experiments, and it's that experimentation that I really like to look at. But going further back, yet again into the 1930s, we have the first instances when developers and planners and architects were realizing that cars were going to be taking over in some form, and that the typical main street was not going to be enough. This is a very famous, still there on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., called Park and Shop. No, I forget the name of it already. Something like that. But it was very interesting because they pulled the buildings back from the street in order to provide parking. And we take that as like, uh-huh, yeah, sure. But in fact, this project was widely published, widely discussed, as a kind of incredible innovation to allow the car and its passengers to actually have an easier time shopping. Today, this is considered a teeny, cute little place, but it was created quite a stir and had many imitators because suburbanization in wealthier districts was well underway. And so it's really interesting to go back and see how some of these adjustments were being made. Of course, on your coast, these things were also happening. We have Albert Fry did kind of drive-in markets, usually associated with gas stations in the 1930s. Also on Wilshire Boulevard, we see this kind of image that's very famous, but what we don't see is that the parking lots are behind the buildings. So they were very aware also, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of that, that the new way of accessing shopping was going to be by car. And this is Crenshaw, also in San Francisco, that had a huge parking lot, a series of stores. And also we're seeing larger planning mechanisms, larger real estate deals, but already seeing this kind of transformation of new land use, new traffic patterns, the automobile, and even new scales of shopping. So back to the 40s again, this is Linda Vista on the West Coast in the state of Washington, if I recall. And this was an experimental outdoor facility, and the pictures of it are really fantastic. You see a man reading the newspaper. You see women and children. As I mentioned, women or children are the key kind of graphic parts of understanding how shopping could work and be safe and be a kind of new environment for new customers. So these are some of the best images of that period when we see the experiment, as I said, the experimentation with different layouts, usually pedestrian base, people walking, but not in the street. And so we see here on the left a study by Willow von Moltke, an architect on the East Coast, where on on the bottom, we see a typical intersection in a city, which is bad, and then the new version of a pedestrianized shopping street above, which is good. And so we get the kind of logics of pedestrianization, of greenery, and that kind of full sense of like the city is no longer kind of working for us. On the right, we see two examples from the 1940s of small towns that were trying to take that idea. And so in this is Mount Kisco, New York, a new shopping mall where Main Street had been, with parking lots behind. This is a pattern you see all over the country. Some of it really destructive, taking a lot of buildings out and really doing a lot of demolition, tying into highway systems. But at the time, to build a new shopping mall, a pedestrian way was considered a kind of a progressive growth, and to save the small town, to save the city. And here sorry about the crop here, but it's a kind of small shopping center with a green park, children's playground, they call it, at the rear. This is Carl Feiss in 1939, 1940. So I love the experiments that were taking place. I also cannot resist that also in the late 1950s, a game called Park and Shop. It was the first edition was in early 1950s when Allentown, Pennsylvania was trying to figure out how to improve its downtown so people would come back to the downtown, and they created a parking voucher system. And then the guy said, "Hey, why don't we make it a board game?" And so you can see here, you roll the dice, you move around, if somebody's walking too slow, or driving too slow, then you have to get around them. So it's a funny game that they wanted people to associate with going downtown. So you get this competition between kind of suburbanizing versions of shopping versus re-urbanizing or making stores palatable, and done mostly by providing off-site parking with vouchers. And so off-site parking was a kind of idea that if you could locate parking in a district, you could help the downtown. Some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't, and in some neighborhoods it just wasn't feasible. But you can see that the game itself and actually existed for several decades when it also became a mall shopping game. So the whole idea of thinking about shopping was a part of popular culture as well. Also in the 50s, we see a bit of experimentation. Here's I think this is Stonestown on the bottom. You may be familiar with. And once again, now we're seeing something that looks like Gruen again, a kind of an alley of trees, sculptures with planters, and a kind of mix of you can call it a sidewalk, you can call it a kind of pedestrian way. Above is a 1950s proposal by Morris Ketchum, who was a former partner of Gruen, for a huge open space surrounded by stores. That was not a great model. It turned out to be too big. People didn't want to cross, so luckily it didn't get built because it wouldn't have lasted. And up on the right isn't already forgotten what image that is, but it became a kind of normal, typical formula for building a pedestrian route down the middle, which you can see here, surrounded by buildings, surrounded by cars, and then, of course, single-family homes in the suburbs behind it. And so now we begin to see the kind of experimentation that led up to all of this. And throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. These are malls from the Midwest of the US from the 70s. And if you bother me, I'll actually find out where they're from. I have a whole set of postcards actually. And the fountains, special lighting, some of them on the bottom completely weirdly interior lit. I don't get it. Above, more using natural light. Fountains were essential. Many of these malls had art programs, and on the left we have the Galleria from '68, which was a kind of very fantastically new invention, was to create an open arcade, and it was quite famous and remains a destination now, hugely kind of populated with other office buildings and residential areas. So now we're coming back around towards the present, and what's happening? What's going on? Um, well, on the one hand, you probably all know the expression "dead mall." And I think I forgot my dead mall picture, but all over the country, malls were going out of business, and I think I don't have the time to quite go into that. But the interesting thing is that early malls were built on what is now a very valuable property. So one of the things that malls have going for them is that the developers are now building other things back in the city, also in the suburbs. So this is the Americana in LA, and Bay Street in Emeryville, California, and so the outdoor mall, which had its roots even in the '60s in San Diego and Horton Plaza and a few others. But this, in some ways, is what is returning in spite of the internet, in spite of COVID. Not that I'm necessarily optimistic about shopping per se, but that it's fascinating from a land use perspective to rethink the community idea, to rethink housing. Housing is one of the most popular elements to use in these revitalized sites. All over the country, they're tearing down malls and building housing with smaller malls or interior malls. So there's you know interesting things going on, not necessarily always about shopping, but a perspective of the fascinate of land use and the value of these places that are well situated. Of course, I couldn't not show the American Dream. I did skip the Mall of America. I apologize, but took you right to the American Dream, which opened right before COVID, which you can imagine was not a great thing to happen. But it's actually doing okay now. It's kind of a monstrosity out by the stadium in the Meadowlands of New Jersey, and I love a whole store based on sugar, finally calling out the reality of our diets. Also, in some ways, the kind of making the spectacle of the mall return in some ways, or trying to. Um, and I think that the jury's still out, although it seems to be doing okay. So between redevelopment of properties and the continued expansion of the mall as a kind of spectacle, much more than just shopping, but in some studies, 50, 60, 70% of these places are entertainment based, not necessarily shopping based. And I think that's a key indicator of where we are as a culture, what is a worthwhile investment, for better or worse. And there we are. A quick travel in memory lane.
Thank you, David. Wonderful. At this point, I'm going to invite all of our panelists back on, and we'll dive right into the Q&A. We do have a few questions already, and I wanted to get right into them. So I think I'll start with the audience questions, and then if there's time, I can ask my own. But John Ashbaugh is asking, maybe this is a question for Jeff and David. How many of Victor Gruen's shopping centers still exist in any form, whether retail or mixed use, et cetera?
That is a good one. I don't know, to be honest. There was a point I counted them all up, and it was like when he leaves the firm in '68, they continue. Caesar Pelli ends up there. Frank Gehry works there for a couple of years, and so the firm continues, and they continue churning out shopping malls for a while until the '80s or so. The firm still continues to this day. I don't think they do retail as much as they used to. But I know over in San Leandro, there's a good one. Good in the sense of in terms of preservation thinking. It's sort of one of the few that remains. I know Northland in Detroit was torn down recently. Southdale in Minnesota continues, but in a very changed feeling to it. Big one outside Chicago was Randhurst, which was the largest mall in the world when it was originally built. And that did, to someone's question, that did have bunkers in the basement that were
Shelters.
yeah, thank you. But I still, when I went there at some point in the 90s, I remember someone giving me a tour. And they had all the leasing documents in these shelters, and they still had them like stocked with water. I don't know if they were still thinking of using them in some way, but I think Randhurst got torn down as well. So there are some. It's an interesting question. I think the Santa Monica Mall that was done later, Geary had a hand in some of those designs. That's still around. Let me know when you figure it out.
For better or worse, the definition of a mall is that it has a lifespan, like any
Right.
commercial enterprise.
Yeah.
It's a fashion. It's a question of fashion and style. And every 10 to 20 years, a mall has to be redone. It's just the nature of the business. So it's very rare. You look at Roosevelt Field by
Yeah.
Pei, and it's gone. It's buried under there somewhere. If you did an archaeological clearing of some of the walls, you might find a piece of steel that Pei specified. But it's the nature of retail in many ways.
Yeah. True.
Yeah, thank you. Prior to today's program, I just out of curiosity, I typed into Chat GPT which Gruen malls still exist are in California. And I don't know how accurate this is, as we
What'd
always
you
have
come
to
up with?
use
Yeah.
circumspection when we're using ChatGPT, but there's a list of about 10 to 12 here. Bayfair in San Leandro, South Bay in Redondo Beach,
Yeah.
Westfield Topanga, Canoga Park, Fulton Mall in Fresno, which I think we mentioned during our last call, but that not much of that remains. South Coast Plaza,
Mm-hmm.
Mill Irons, Westchester in Los Angeles, Wilshire, Beverly, and Beverly Hills, which I believe is a office building. I don't think it's a
That's
mall.
that's the corporate headquarters
Oh, okay. Yeah.
for Gruen. Yeah. And
So yeah,
yeah,
some of those aren't, Fulton Mall was a pedestrian mall really, and it was, I think, recently returned to car traffic. A lot of the pedestrian portion of it was torn out for cars recently, so there's not much left remaining of that. But anyways, sorry, Jeff, did you want to add anything to that?
no, that's a good list. I think Mill Irons is his early, like 1948 department store in LA, which gets a lot of press because it's got rooftop parking and a restaurant on the roof also. So I guess you can watch the cars drive by. But yeah, I think some of those are later 70s as well. But that is a good list.
Great. I'll move on to the next question. This is actually from Ted, and I'm digging deep here in terms of Richard Longstreth. Last time I read anything from him was in grad school, but how does Richard Longstreth analysis of early retail away from downtown LA on the Miracle Mile, Bolix, Wilshire, for example, anticipate Victor Gruen's suburban malls or not?
That's a good one. So Longstreth, I'll say his book came out before mine. And so he was interested in that earlier period. And I think he does a lot of great work at some of what David was talking about, the 1920s shopping centers. And a lot of those turn to, catering to the automobile. And Longstreth is fantastic at that. It's funny, though, when Gruen moves out to LA, I think he expects to get more commissions out there. And he doesn't have much luck. And Longstreth always joked with me that he was definitely a B architect in LA, and because he couldn't get commissions essentially. He got more commissions up in San Francisco, say, but I think that was because one, the architecture was fundamentally more strip oriented, and he really wanted to do these giant developments. He does do stuff. He helps design Irvine later on, and ends up being more involved in city planning around LA, but that's later in his career. but he doesn't have much luck with early retailing. And I think Longstreth would say that he just didn't understand fundamentally LA and automobile culture.
Mm-hmm.
But his book's
Long
fantastic also.
Longstreth is the dean of our field, and so you one has to one can always check his books. Gruen, I think, is yeah, he in some cases I think he was um there was competition and people charged, other architects charged less, and it was a tough business. The commissions were small. I do think that what's important about the LA especially is that there was plenty of experimentation. Just even the gas stations themselves were experiments with off-street uses, and then the markets and the farmers markets. And so that's why Longstreth deals a lot with the West Coast as a kind of its own experimental territory for this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to switch gears here and direct a question to Anne. This is interesting, Anne. They're asking, and I know during our early call you mentioned that you can't speak much to sort of future plans for these places, but maybe you have some thoughts. This question is: Downtown Chicago has seen many of their original department stores converted to colleges and universities, or other uses, say housing or other types of adaptive reuse. Has this shown up in San Francisco, or at least is there hints of maybe plans for places like the Emporium or the Old City of Paris, or
Yes, London Breed, our outgoing mayor, has made some proposals for the Westfield and its use. SF State had been, I think they still have at least some of the office space for sort of downtown classrooms, but that was there well before the retail part started going under. But Breed, I forget exactly the use, but it definitely had a academic purpose. And also I think a stadium came up, but that if anybody else knows that, let me correct me. It's just they're just desperately trying to revive downtown, and the loss of Macy's isn't good. So they're just trying whatever they can make work.
Thanks. And yeah, I was struck by a recent inspirational project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. One of their earliest department stores, I believe, was recently converted into housing. And they kept the original storefronts and arcades and everything. So it's an interesting kind of case example of, I mean, maybe Jeff or David could speak to this in terms of like, do you feel these spaces are flexible enough for adaptive reuse or conversion into different uses, or are they just too inflexible? I know everybody talks about office buildings, very difficult, especially post 1940s office buildings being difficult to convert into housing, for example, but are shopping malls the same way?
Um, Malls themselves, as I mentioned, were after the first generation, let's say, were not meant to live forever. They were never intended to. It was part of the budget that they would be changed. Many of them started having troubles because they weren't big enough. So the first generation, the second generation, the third generation, they got bigger, they got further out from the city. So the first generation malls ended up being in trouble because they were too small. Sometimes they would end up being in poor neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods, very different clientele. And so the kind of cycling wasn't just the building itself, but population moving further out from the city and bigger malls. So the 70s malls especially were much further out. They were actually quite interesting in their own quirky ways. But so I think reuse, like the Levittown in New Jersey, in Willingboro, it's now called, is actually a very early reuse of the mall, and some of it remained. It was turned into a kind of couple of nonprofits, a kind of college facilities. Nothing glamorous, but it actually was a right for the neighborhood, which was not a big market and that was why the mall failed in the first place. Um, there are uses because, as I said, the land is still valuable because it's usually close to something. And so that's the problem for preservation, I would imagine, is that the tear down is easy. But malls were not seen as institutions of museums and libraries and such. For the most part, they were seen as investments. And
Mm.
the tax system was organized to make sure that was clear, and the investors were in charge by the mid 70s in basically deciding whether a mall would stay or go. One other thing I'll say about malls, sorry if I'm going on, but a lot of research has gone on in the past decade or so into malls that were meant for Hispanic communities, for uh, Asian communities on the West Coast, and there's a whole new generation of users of malls that are more aimed at all the immigrants from various countries in Asia. The same thing with Latino cultures in the US. And there are what we would call malls. We might call them open markets. We might call them kind of other kinds of things. And they're actually quite amazing. There are some in LA, I think, or out on the West Coast, where the signage is completely in non-English language because the users are not looking for that. So you could say the malls are still in some way are fulfilling community needs, just not the kind of white middle class communities from which they emerged.
Hmm. Yeah, excellent points, David. I wish I could go into all the questions we have here. I'll maybe close out with somebody was asking if there are any Googie designs that you can point to. And the reason I want to close with this question is both of your books, David and Jeff, talk about Morris Lapidus, who, in many ways is considered an early Googie architect, right? And a protege of Gruen and others. And I think his type of architecture was about joy and fun in architecture. And Googie, I think, out of everything else, is probably, representative of that. But maybe if either of you could point to an interesting Googie mall design that we should look up in Google image search, if you can.
I think
Uh,
not
that's
much
a good
left.
one. Uh, it's funny. I mean, Gruen argues when he first starts building shopping malls that they shouldn't have signs, that the signs are like visual clutter and pollution in the suburbs. And so he tries to strike any signage and he builds them all behind these sort of uh, high berms so that they wouldn't be visible as well. That's why you get that weird, when you go into a shopping mall and they still kind of maintain this. So you go in and then you're already on a secondary road before you get to the parking. But I would look at his Grayson's stuff. He does a lot for Grayson's women's wear during World War II. And he does, I mean, it is googie beyond belief. It is, thousands of neon lights and giant signs and meant to be seen from the highway. He has one in Seattle. I'm trying to think if he did one in the Bay Area. Definitely down in LA, there's one. A couple on the East Coast as well, one in Philadelphia downtown. But those are these massive, fantastic, fun stores that, are of a moment. I don't know if many of them survive, to be honest.
Lapidus did do a proposal and was partially built for closing Lincoln Road in Miami. And some of
Yeah.
his little doodads, googies for signage and for shelters and such were done, and then they were torn down. And then the renovation of just a decade ago actually tried to kind of reboot the kind of Lapidus language. Um, but also the street was depedestrianized in part. So it's a kind of very interesting change from that. If you want to see Lapidus, there's still a few hotels in Miami or the area that still have that. I don't think um, You know, no, I can't think of any, but
Those
he,
were some great examples, though. I just
yeah,
searched Google Images. I don't know if quickly I'll share here before we jump off, but um, here's Lincoln Road in Miami, and Grayson's kind of struck me. Is this what you were referring to, Jeff? Is some of this,
yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that
right?
Grayson, yeah, that one's Philadelphia. The other one, where is that one, the neon one? I mean, it's funny also because he's doing them during the war, so he's under restrictions in terms of construction and lighting. And Grayson is always touting how closely they're following all the rules in terms of construction, but you see that bank of neon lights and you sort of wonder how well closely they followed it. Those are and Grayson's was big, of course, because women are working during World War II and have disposable income and can buy clothing.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion in terms of lighting and architecture and design and all these things, which I wish we had more time to do this program and maybe come back again at some point in the future and talk with the three of you about some other elements of some of these structures. But thank you all again for your time. This has been really wonderful and a great way to close out our program. I won't go too much into it, but I just wanted to remind people that today at 8 p.m. our annual auction closes. So I'm going to paste this into the chat box here very quickly because the three books that we've discussed today will also be offered for auction. So please do bid on any items on that link that I just pasted into the chat box, which supports our ongoing education programs throughout the year and our mission. I wanted to close it out. I don't know if Cindy had anything. Cindy Heitzman is our executive director. If she had any final words, but wanted to thank you all again. Look forward to seeing you in the new year for additional programs.
All right, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. It was a wonderful program. Just wanted to thank everyone for attending and to remind everyone, as John said, we have our auction is closing. And we also ask everyone who's attending, all of our supporters, to please consider supporting CPF with an end of year gift. It helps us throughout the year. So thank you all for your support.
Goodbye, everyone.